Welcome back. This is part 3 of our question and answer session from the Flowers of Immortality presentation. And thank you again for all the wonderful questions that there was not enough time to cover. And so we are covering them more now. So here's another question. I notice in this area, I notice in this era that we are in, most people are so in their heads, bombarded with constant Wi-Fi and all kinds of other energy and data. The root chakras are typically closed. What are your tips for simple and effective ways folks can ground themselves and also be more aware when the root closes or had distortion? All right, now rather than answer this question directly at first, I would like to share my thinking process on this kind of question. All right. And my style of answering this kind of question is to ask more questions. So in other words, it's like a Socratic method of teaching, because I think that we could have different answers to this that don't really have really much value. But we could also use this question as an opportunity to ask a lot of other questions. And as we ask more questions, then we could actually really learn a lot just from asking the questions and exploring it. So let's explore this instead of answering it, all right? So first of all, there is a statement here. The root chakras are typically closed. Now, the way that I would explore this statement is I would say, what does that mean? What does it mean that the root chakras are typically closed? Does it mean, for example, if we link it to Ayurveda, does it mean that the first chakra is closed in terms of large intestine function and that a person has constipation? Okay, there's a link that could be made, because Ayurveda links the apana vata, the downward moving vata, the downward moving prana of the lower intestinal system to the first chakra, you see. And so this is why it's very important to understand where we start the diagnosis, where we start the conversation, how we answer the question. So if we look at it through the standpoint that in Ayurveda, the first chakra, the earth element, is related to the colon and to elimination, then what we see is a different answer than we might find if we're looking at it from another standpoint. So the first question then is, what does it mean that the root chakras are closed? All right, and just asking for further clarification about the question itself starts to reveal that many people have some assumptions or some previous information about the chakras that may be helpful or maybe not helpful. So what I would say here is first, let's explore what it means that the root chakras are closed. All right. I think we can come up with some real simple, obvious examples of what it means that the root chakras are closed. So first of all, in the classical system, the chakras were not thought of as really being things that are there. The chakras were places inside the body to do meditation practice, okay? And in many of the systems, the root chakra wasn't even used at all. For example, in the Tibetan Tummo yoga, the lowest chakra is really somewhere below the umbilicus. And that's found in Taoism as well. There's very little emphasis on first and second chakras in a lot of traditions. It's really more like the lower dantian is more of a region, or the region is sometimes called the hara. And therefore, it's the region of the body that is used for a particular purpose. Now, here's a curiosity that's related to this question, and that is that in most of these classical yogas, the whole purpose was to close the chakras, okay? And that is because the lower chakras are seen as a way that the life force escapes from us, that it's always moving downward, back towards the earth. It's moving down with bowel movements. It's going out of the body with urination. It's passing out of the body with the menstrual flow. It's passing out of the body with ejaculation of sperm. All of these things are outward moving flows. Now, of course, all of that has healthy and unhealthy manifestations, but in terms of energy, the overall function of the chakra system was to help us to turn our mind inwardly and to turn our mind away from these kind of lower biological functions into higher cognitive functions, all right? And so when we look at these practices, they're teaching us close the lower chakras, turn the attention inward and hold the breath and raise the prana upward. So it's all about sealing off the lower part of the body. And that's where we get these practices like Kegels. They're basically Kegels combined with breath retention. We're trying to teach the body to hold prana. So that's one of the things we discover if we start asking these questions, is that maybe there's nothing wrong with the lower chakras being closed. Maybe they're supposed to be in meditation. So the final part of this is a completely different question. And what are your tips for simple and effective ways that folks can ground themselves and also be more aware when the root closes or had distortion? Well, all right, the simple answer to that is meditation, and to become increasingly sensitive to body sensations. And the more time we spend in that inner landscape, the more we become aware of what our body is doing. And that's great medically, it's great emotionally, it's great psychologically, to have a high level of awareness of body sensations and processes. And that makes us more aware of the subtle energies as well. All right, so let's move on here. And here is a really good one. I'm just going to reiterate. This is something that I touched on in the presentation, but I'm going to reiterate this one more time. How many chakras are there? And I answer that in so many different ways, but I just want to sum it up very briefly again. And that is, there's all different systems, and there are different numbers of chakras. The most important thing to remember is not the numbers. The basic question is, well, how many do we need? We use the chakras in the classical system for practicing different methods of meditation. That's the answer. All right. And so, here's a nice one. Is it possible that with the spiritual emphasis on embodiment that has been emerging over the last few decades, that the recent teachings on the chakras are indeed accurate and an extension of the original, more esoteric teachings? Very good question, very thought-provoking question here. And let's look at this in some detail. And let's also question this as well. Is it possible that with the spiritual emphasis on embodiment over the last few decades? Well, all right, what does that actually mean? What is the emphasis on embodiment? I think that we would find most of this happening in New Age teachings in the West. Okay, there's much more emphasis on this because I think that in many parts of the world, there really hasn't been any attention placed on this at all. I think that there's probably a population of people in the West that are hearing about these kind of practices, embodiment practices. But I think in many parts of the world, this hasn't come into people's awareness. And most people probably aren't even thinking that they need something like this, because keep in mind that in most parts of the world, people are pretty embodied in a lot of ways, just from the fact that they have to work hard physically. They work on farms, they do their jobs, they are embodied, okay? In the West, I would say that the real statement here is that we are increasingly disembodied. It's like from the last question about all the Wi-Fi and the internet and screen time. I would say that this is really how we're getting disembodied. And of course, body dysmorphia from social media and all the mental health issues that it's creating. That's a really good example of disembodiment. But do I think that the recent teachings on the chakras are indeed accurate and an extension of the original, more esoteric teachings? And I think that there's a continuation from the classical practices into contemporary teachings about what the chakras are, but I do think that there are some things that are missing. And this is what I spent quite a bit of time on in the presentation. And that is the fundamental difference between the classical teachings and the contemporary teachings. And the fundamental difference is that the contemporary teachings don't really have a clearly articulated spiritual goal. It's really more about the biopsychology of mental health, mental, emotional, psychological well-being. It's really more of a system for healing. And that's where the links between the physical locations of the chakras and the organ systems and the emotions, and we start to see all these layers that are incredibly valuable for diagnosis and treatment. And so we see gut-brain axis. Okay, that's a modern concept. All right. It was known in classical Asian medicine, but let's say gut-brain axis. Well, what chakra would that relate to? It relates to the third chakra very specifically. Okay, because it has to do with digestion. And so therefore, if we start to add these layers, then we start to see the gut-brain axis connected to this chakra and this chakra associated with these kinds of mental states, emotional feelings, and so forth. What we can see is that the contemporary system is a really good system of body-mind medicine, okay? But that's not what the classical system was about. It was not about body-mind medicine. It was about enlightenment. It was about emancipation from samsara, from suffering. It was about moving from our biological functions and attachment to the body into spirit. It was about refining the jing, the essence of the lower body, into the qi in the heart, and then refining the qi in the heart into the spirit, and then returning spirit to the Tao. In other words, it was about achieving immortality. It was about achieving transcendence. It was about achieving complete liberation, gone beyond. That's the difference. And so therefore, embodiment practices in the West, are they beneficial? Sure, especially for those who, are having trouble being in their bodies. How can we do that? Using the classical methods. Well, the most important classical method, as I described, is just keep bringing the attention back to the inner landscape. That's what these people were doing. They were living inside the inner landscape, where the mind is inside the body and the body is being experienced inside the mind. That's the interface between mind and matter. That is where these practices are done. And if we are doing these practices deeply and repetitively, and we are breathing into them, we're learning how to circulate the qi and the prana, we're developing our ability to visualize inside that landscape, we are becoming increasingly embodied. And we are also doing it with a very specific goal, which is we're not doing it to resolve our psychological issues. That will happen as a side effect. We are doing this to understand who we are at the level of spirit, who we are at the deepest level of mind, who we are in terms of our biological reality, and so on. Excellent, excellent question. Good topic for conversation. And I'll also mention that these topics about embodiment are really the essence of what the whole Illuminated Chakra course is about. And so therefore, we're going to be doing embodiment practices over and over again in that course. All right, so that's it with our part 3 of question and answer. Thank you.